Welcome to Lificast 2022. We are the official partner of the Leeds International Festival of Ideas. My name is Johnny Ianson, and as ever, it is a pleasure to be back with you. We are living in an age of the climate crisis as we battle to enact the promises made at COP26, which reaffirmed the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrialized levels, and actually pursuing efforts to try and limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And today we're asking, can it be done without equality? Climate change affects women disproportionately, affects the poor disproportionately, and communities of colour disproportionately. But there have been battle lines drawn between communities who are trying to fight climate change and those who say they are disruptive extremists. Well, let's talk about this today and ask the question, what is wrong with climate activism? To do that is Si Davis from the Jubilee movement. Hello, Si.
Hello, Johnny.
And we're also joined by Steve Connor, a previous Extinction Rebellion Leeds social justice coordinator who advocates the left and environment movement adopt democratic confederalism. Steve, hello.
Hi.
We'll get into what all that means in just a moment's time. But let's start with you, Si. Tell us, it's a new organisation. Mm-hmm. What is it you do? What is it you're hoping to achieve?
Okay, so we are very much a grassroots organisation. We start from the position that there is one unifying factor, which is debt. Countries are in debt, people are in debt. Debt stops action. Until we cancel all unjust debt, then nothing else we do really matters. So that's the starting position, that's the unifying position. Jubilee doesn't mean the Queen's celebration. It means celebration. It's ancient, it's historic, it goes back thousands of years. It goes back right to the start of money. Debt has been cancelled. It used to be cancelled every 7 years, and every 50 years you'd have a reset. All the slaves would be released. They'd be released from debt bondage, and then they would celebrate, society could reset. We're in a point where we need a reset moment, and that's what Jubilee is about. And we look at the climate emergency as just one symptom within a very diseased system. And because it's one symptom, we have to tackle the disease, which means we then need to build a movement. And so it's all about movement building. It's about joining up with the intersections, joining up with those who are fighting on social justice, on global justice, on climate justice, building in communities for local power to confront change. And sort of like what we really are aiming at is, at the end of the day, the big thing is revolution.
So, Steve, you've been in an organisation which you've left recently within...
within the last month or so.
Within the last month or so, okay. So you've been within probably the most high-profile environmental organisation of recent times, I would say. It certainly grabbed the headlines anyway. Yeah. It seems like a lot of what Si was talking about, Extinction Rebellion perhaps shared, but you didn't share what they were doing or their vision. Why did you leave?
I think one of the key problems with Extinction Rebellion is that it although one of its mottos is to tell the truth, it doesn't really tell the truth about the climate crisis. It won't name the problem being the entire socio and economic system that we're living under, capitalism. I think this is done in a misguided sense of trying to include a broad cross-section of society in the climate movement. But the problem is, if you're confronting something, a problem that is an endemic problem of the entire social and economic system that you're living in, you can't attempt to co-opt people who support it and think that they're going to help you to change it, because that's just not going to happen. And this is fundamentally what XR's strategy is. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great people in XR. My criticisms are with it as an organisation and how it functions and its strategy. It's an organisation that unfortunately is not democratic. It has a very obscure administrative system, which is based on something from the tech industry, really. And inevitably, it's become dominated by small cliques of people who are very London-centred. And I found, after spending a couple of years trying to work internally to change the organisation that I was wasting my time. And I came to think that, to some extent, XR was now part of the problem and not the solution.
So it's an interesting point you raise, because you both touch on the same issue of capitalism being one of the major causes of climate change. And it sounds like what you're saying is that rich people can't be part of the solution, which, if they're part of the problem, they have to be, don't they?
Well, I would look, what I would do is would step back from that polarization of whether rich people can be part of the solution. The system requires the extraction of resources from people, and it does not account for the cost of that. So we've got a climate emergency because business doesn't have to pay the cost of a climate emergency. That's pushed away. We have an emergency of inequality because basically the system pushes the cost of reproducing itself onto ordinary people. So if you can't afford a meal at the end of the month, that doesn't get counted as a cost to business, and wealth moves up. And we saw that really clearly in the pandemic, where the bottom 50% of people lost $3.6 trillion. The billionaires, those that already have 1 billion or more, made 3.7 trillion. Money flows in a one-way direction. And it's what sits at the root of the climate emergency. So we all have to come together. It's not whether you're rich, it's whether it's identifying what the problem is that needs to be addressed. And the problem is the economic system, which requires profit and causes that harm, which is why we're there. So it's not about rich people.
Is the conversation enough about that side of things? And Steve, I'm probably preempting your answer here, but when we look at what Si's talking about, research by Oxfam shows that the world's richest 10% of people cause 50% of emissions, and conversely, the world's poorest 50% only contribute to 10%. But people tend not to talk about that. And I wonder if it's because climate change seems like such a difficult, enormous issue to tackle, that then to say on top of it, we need to tackle inequality, racism, problems within gender inequality. Is just too big an issue.
I think we live in a society in which political debate has been heavily trivialised and also personalised. So there's a great reluctance to talk about problems as being structural. It's not about whether somebody's about individuals. It's about the structures of society. The internal dynamic of capitalism is that it must grow continually or collapse. That basically what capitalism is a machine for turning the environment's resources, the world's resources, into mostly crap that goes into landfill or food that's thrown away. It's a totally inefficient system. That it's a bit like we're out on the limb of a branch on a tree, and we're sawing away while we're sat on it. This isn't because somebody sat down and said we need to destroy the earth to make money. It's the fundamental dynamic of capitalism. It's led us out of the dynamic of capitalism has taken us away from scarcity. We now have the ability to feed people, but the system is not geared to do that. It's geared towards waste and constant destruction.
But you're talking about then trying to change a system which people have been trying to do for many, many years at a time when the climate emergency dictates that we do something now. And many people would argue to say we don't have the time to challenge capitalism and focus on reducing the issues around climate change. Or would you say, well, they're both inextricably linked, so you can't do one without the other?
They are inextricably linked. The problem with the either-or argument is, in some ways, it leads to an inaction on both sides, both issues. It leads to to solutions like green people promising that there's green capitalism will solve problems. It's a deflection. There's a constant deflection away from the real issues. The fact is that capitalism is in crisis. It's reaching its limits in terms of the destruction of the environment. It is changing. I believe that capitalism will disappear. What worries me is that the likelihood at the moment is that something even worse will replace it. We're already seeing a return to the use of slavery and working conditions that are close to serfdom across the world. There's even in some of the responses that are trying to be green, there are distinct hints of something we call eco-fascism developing, which is basically save the white people and let everyone else die. And that is a very insidious discourse that is not explicit, but it is implicit in a lot of the plans to address the climate emergency. Unfortunately, in things like the Green New Deal, in many ways, what that is arguing for is a new form of just a different type of extractive economy, in which the resources, all the rare metals that we need for our, I was just going to pick up my phone, but it's not to hand, but it's in our phones, that will be in the electric car batteries. Many of the solutions put forward to the climate crisis involve just doubling down on the exploitation of the global south.
So what do we do to try and fix things in the meantime then, Simon? If and I'm guessing you maybe share a similar viewpoint to what Si's talking about there, but the obvious argument is, well, we look to capitalism for people like Elon Musk and his Teslas. We look towards people like BP, who are doing a lot of work in the field of green energy, or Siemens and building of wind farms on off the coast of the North Sea. I mean, without capitalism, they can't be built. They don't exist.
Okay, can I move away from the word capitalism for a minute? Because I think we could get bogged down in it. What you're kind of, and I think this is such an important area to look at, and I don't want to just concentrate on one word, although I think it's really important to name that word. What we're talking about here is a very white way of looking at things, okay? We're talking about the issues are too big. It's too big to look at inequality. We need to deal with climate emergency. That's a really white, privileged way of looking at stuff, okay? So we focus on the climate emergency as white people because we feel it affects us, but it isn't affecting people equally. Okay, that's the important piece. It's going to affect everyone, but it doesn't affect everybody equally. So Vijay Prashad, who's an Indian economist, spoke in Glasgow, and he said, the United Nations framework on climate change has come up with the words common and differentiated responsibilities. Well, you've got the common very well, but you don't accept the differentiated. Okay, we have got responsibility to act because whilst we say inequality might be too big a thing to deal with now, that is not the emergency that marginalised communities are feeling. So if you want to have marginalised communities in a space, then you have to speak to more than one emergency. And that's what Jubilee is about. It's about saying this isn't one problem. This is a multitude of problems. Naomi Klein calls it, we have to address everybody's emergencies. So if you're a woman, you've got one set of emergencies. If you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, you've got another set of emergencies. If you're black, you've got another set of emergencies. They're all intersections and they work upon one another. And the climate emergency will multiply that risk. Debt will multiply that risk. Okay. So when you mention Siemens and all of those companies, they absolutely are going to benefit from this. Okay, so at the moment from the Global South, you've got the appropriation of raw materials, you've got appropriation of land, labour and resources to an extent which is unbelievable. literally unbelievable. And so when you ask, why are they in that situation? I did development studies 40 years ago. The idea was there's going to be catch-up. There can be no catch-up. From 1960 to the present to 2018, if you look at the indicators of inequality, there has, if you exclude China, it has not changed. With China, there's been a slight difference. They've been on a different development pathway and it alters the picture. But in reality, there has been no change. That is what 50, 60 years of development does, and it will continue. And this new move to moving away from fossil fuel, although that is going to be delayed to the last possible moment, next 28th of July, the Congo are putting 16 blocks of land up. We've only found this out a few days ago. 16 blocks of land up for auction. They are land of peatland, the second largest carbon sink in the world, 20 billion tons of carbon tied up in them, in order to be able to be sold for fossil fuel. Because the fossil fuel companies have not listened to COP. They're going to carry on profiting. That's what capitalism does. That's what inequality does. So we have to talk about that. That's why this podcast is so important, because the media don't. They think it is possible to have solar power and wind farms. Well, where are they? Okay, they will be there, but when it's way too late.
Is it also just too big a conversation to try and have? The reality is that we like snappy slogans. We like 5-minute conversations at best. We try and fix a climate problem. It's hard enough. And then you say, well, we need to address inequality. And then you say, we need to fight capitalism. And when you start mixing all those in, people just throw their hands up, because you've just said we need to basically sort every single person on planet Earth's problem before we can fix the global problem. How can you possibly do that? Because it's too big a thing in people's heads to try and deal with.
Yeah, I think one of the key problems is that we're going through a crisis of legitimacy in the organisations and states and the whole democratic system of running the world. Many people are turning towards extreme right solutions. Part of the reason for this, I think, is because the left has lost its way. The left has got no new ideas. On the right, they have reformulated fascism in a form where they've thrown away the jackboots for the most part, and are wearing suits and are marching through the institutions, as we've seen in the States. The left is kind of stuck in a small number of people still romanticising the political cul-de-sac of the Soviet model, and many people still believing that they can make substantial changes through our existing democratic system, despite all the evidence to the contrary. That's one reason why I think democratic confederalism is interesting. It is a new paradigm for the left, and it also emerged in the global south.
So give us a really simple, clean, quick explanation of it.
It's ecological, it's explicitly feminist. It involves the people, mainly at the base of society, organising the systems many of which used to be run by the state, which increasingly, under the neoliberal consensus, the state has stepped back from with policies of austerity. You can see it even in Britain, people running their own libraries, etc. Now, in Kurdistan, in the Syrian part of Kurdistan, where democratic confederalism is being put into practice, the Syrian state basically walked away and left the Kurdish areas to govern themselves. And they have instituted a whole network of community-based organisations that run the distribution of food, how the economy is planned, policing, courts. This is all done on a street-by-street basis.
But you think we could, we were fighting over toilet roll during the pandemic. Do you think that we could possibly run the systems that the councils and the government run now?
Yeah, and this has been this is what, throughout the history of the labour movement, the people at the base, the trade unions, etc., have always tried to do. That in any revolutionary situation, or even at the period during the birth of the Labour Party with the cooperative movement, ordinary people can run things perfectly well. What is needed to draw people together, to unite this whole network of human solidarity, mutualism, is the coordinated ideological position and organisation, which is what democratic confederalism provides.
There is also, though, the argument that activism and a more purposeful, immediate activism will make a difference, such as kids not going to school, such as mass marches on whether it's Leeds City Centre or Parliament in London, people gluing themselves to bridges and blocking motorways side. Does that work in the meantime?
It's worked very, very well at drawing attention to a problem.
Has it changed anything, though?
It has not changed anything, because Insulate Britain sat on the roads. The government formed its energy in order to call for insulation, which is obviously so necessary. It's a no-brainer. There can't be many people who would not go, insulating our homes is not a good idea. As we sit in the baking sun today, it would be cooler. In the winter, it would be warmer. We would spend less money on fuel. In the energy strategy that the government came up with, no insulation. They're not going to act upon it, okay? You could say the same with Just Stop Oil. Just Stop Oil, sitting on oil refineries, and they're at the same time as they're doing that, the government's offering new concessions in the North Sea and talking about opening fracking again.
So if that kind of protest and activism doesn't work, is it pointless?
It works to raise consciousness. It works to raise the problem. We need to go further. That's the point. We need to take it further. So, we've got to, you saying to Steve here, how are we going to be able to run this? Okay. But we've already looked at what the problem is. The problem is that we didn't have toilet rolls, and we started getting a bit angsty about it. Okay, what happens when we don't have food? And literally, we don't have food. And that isn't a threat. It's a huge, huge likelihood. When the banks crashed in 2008, if that happens again on top of all the other loans, there's a great argument to say that we're not coming to rescue them next time. Now, we can't really claim that system is working very well. So there must be an alternative. Now, this is where I think it's really important to look at what is called epistemology, a set of beliefs, what makes things work, okay? So Indigenous people, who are very diverse, even within one country, there might be 500 different Indigenous groups, have a couple of things in common. One, we work with nature. We live in balance and harmony with nature. That does not mean we are like Stone Age people living in the forests. It means we understand our connection. Why do we understand our connection? Because we're based in community. Community is the opposite, it's commune. It's the opposite of individualism. It means I am because you are. And if we take that epistemology, that very simple change from what Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society, and say there is actually such a thing as community. We rebuild and we mend fractured, broken communities. And then you offer solutions, real solutions, universal basic income, universal basic services, the commons. When Corbyn talked about about having universal broadband, it was laughed at. How useful would that have been during a pandemic if we all didn't have to get cut off our Zooms every 5 minutes? Okay? For commons, health, education, housing, if we weren't paying 60% of our salaries on rent if you live in an expensive city, then you don't need that much money. If you had shorter working weeks, that's an absolute potential to do more with your life. The fact that most people have to work, that's what the debt is for most people. Their debt drives them to work for 60, 70 hours a week. And that messes with your head. that creates inequalities
and
in
then,
itself. So we can actually sort all of these things out, but we have to say, this system isn't going to do it. It's going to lie to you. And yeah.
The issue with that, though, is that people are so caught up in their own daily struggle that maybe they can't see the wood for the trees when it comes to trying to rebuild communities, when it comes to trying to fight climate change, because they're worried about heating or eating their home. They're worried about gas bills, we've been told today, are going to go up more than the expected £800 for the second time in a year.
That's why climate activism should be meeting people on the terrain of their own issues in the community and supporting them, not separating themselves from people's everyday needs. That's where the whole point of, as Si was saying about end of the month, end of the world, the same fight comes in. It's being there with people for all the problems they're facing. What we've got to realise is that there is very little resilience in the system we're living in. We've seen that to some extent during the COVID crisis. But if we look further south and look at the state of Sri Lanka is a model for what is likely to happen to many countries. Maybe not that extreme in the global north for imminently, but many countries, because of the debt that they're suffering from in the global south, could quite easily, quite quickly slip into the same catastrophic conditions as Sri Lanka. We have to recognise that the state is not going to look after us.
But
it has been captured by financial and fossil fuel interests. So we have to have something organised outside that in the community to try and support ourselves. It's the opposite in a way of the American individualistic response of the individual preppers.
Is there a chance, though, that it starts muddying the issues? Because when you talk about something like Sri Lanka and the difficulties they're in at the moment, that isn't just about obviously having no fuel. There's about corruption within politics itself, which is why people were storming Parliament.
And then you think our politics are not corrupt?
Well, I mean, we know that there are obviously people within Parliament who are behaving totally inappropriately, and we've seen our own Prime Minister be questioned in his honesty.
But the corruption is more institutional.
But the point I'm making is, Steve, that if you start talking about things like that, does that detract or distract away from the issue of rising temperatures, of floods, of forest fires?
I think the distraction is actually the strategy of the fossil fuel industry, is to say it's your individual problem. You can solve it by not consuming as much, doing this, that, spending your whole life trying to be a good green person. I don't think that is a distraction. I think it's telling the truth to people about what's coming and telling them that they need to prepare for what's coming. It's maybe part of the problem in the global north is that people see the climate crisis as something in the distance. In the global south, the apocalypse is here. It's already there. People are dying already due to the climate crisis in large numbers. It was one of the contributing factors to the Syrian civil war. A drought causing people to flee the countryside and come to the cities, and the state did not support them. So we need to realise that it's not something in the distance, and it is coming to us sooner than people think.
Just want to bring this to a close because we are running short on time, but on this issue of individual responsibility, which I think people always want to feel like they can do something. Yeah. It's very easy to feel helpless, particularly when we talk a lot about what we are today of social inequality, of capitalism, and it can all feel way beyond us. Do you feel that there is something we can do to help ourselves personally to at least achieve the goal of what you want to, of ending the world and total annihilation of everybody? I'm looking for something positive to finish on each.
Well, look, the whole thing, I've given you so many positive things. I mean, if you can't see universal basic income and universal basic services are positive.
But how can people achieve that? Because it's not a net gift, is
Okay.
it? We're talking political will there, but from a personal level.
Well, we think we have a way through by basing ourselves in community, by working in community. So we're doing what we call the end of the month meal, which is a piece of radical mutual aid. It's bringing people together. It's to offer a meal. It's to take pressure off the food banks for a day, to work with community organisations, local businesses, to start a conversation that will take things forward. So that is a community vision, and we believe that actually through you sort of like look at the big thing of Sri Lanka. That's too far away. Let's leave that to one side. Let's start in community, but let's have in our mind that Sri Lanka isn't the opposite to what's going on here. Mm-hmm. It's very much the part of the same thing. The positive, people can make positive actions, and they need to make positive changes. Some of them are really good. If you can get off of Greg's and learn how to cook or make some vegetarian food, and I never argue for things to be exclusively vegetarian or vegan, but a much reduced meat consumption would really help the planet, and so would dairy consumption. Definitely. Really, do you need to fly to Amsterdam for a stag do, or could you do it locally? That would certainly save the planet. Go and drive up to Scotland with 3 people in your car and look at the islands. They're absolutely wonderful. There's things you can do, but that isn't really the point. That's what the government wants us to feel, that it's our responsibility. And you've identified it earlier, that 70% of the problem is being caused by a tiny, tiny number of people. Okay, and all the time we avoid naming that, and that's what the media do, and that's why it's so difficult to get our voice out, and why it's so good to be here today to talk with you about these things, is because these are real issues. You can engage with them, and the communities can engage in these conversations. And we're a bit time limited, so it seems like an awful lot. But if this conversation was held over a few weeks at a pub, having a picnic or whatever, it's not hard.
I'd say that people can have these conversations in whatever organisation they're in. Particularly trade unions. The trade unions can have a significant effect, I think. Try and bring people on board. Organise, basically. I think what we need is perhaps less protesting and more organising.
That leads me to a really beautiful
we're going to have to wrap it up here. So hopefully it'll be a nice conclusion.
This really concludes by a Nigerian called Boyo Akomalafi. And he said, "These times are urgent. Let us slow down."
And that seems like the perfect place to finish it, chaps. Thank you very much for joining us today on today's episode of Lificast. Do join us again next time. But in the meantime, do make sure you look after the world and each other, of course, as well. Si and Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you, Johnny.